Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really immersing ourselves in some fascinating source materials. They offer a completely, radical reinterpretation of some really foundational stories.
Foundational narratives of the ancient world, yeah.
Exactly. We're zeroing in on the Israelites' journey, from the wilderness into Canaan, and challenging that traditional view of what that whole operation was really about.
Right. If you carry that traditional mental image of Canaan, the famous land flowing with milk and honey, like this golden ready-made paradise.
Yeah, the postcard version.
Precisely. We're asking you to just maybe put that image aside for a moment, because our sources suggest that very perception, the divine inheritance, this lush, passive reward,
Yeah.
well, that's exactly what obscures the true mission, the historical and theological mission.
Absolutely. The usual story goes, wander for 40 years, then poof, here's your reward land.
Yeah.
But the really provocative idea in these sources is this. Canaan wasn't a gift. It was a task. Yeah. It wasn't this land that just naturally flowed with abundance. Initially, it was pretty harsh. A demanding, geographically stubborn environment. It needed immense effort to cultivate, to settle.
And that changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It completely reframes the mission.
It does.
The command wasn't just, go take this land. It was, enter this difficult place. And through adhering to this revolutionary covenant they carried, they were expected to make it flow with milk and honey.
So it shifts from getting a blessing to undertaking a project. A huge, difficult, multi-generational cultural project. It demanded commitment, structure.
Right. The mission wasn't just about geography, about conquest. It was cultural transformation.
Building the holiest culture possible, as the sources put it?
Exactly. In the toughest environment to sort of prove its viability, its superiority.
Okay. So to understand how they were prepared for this monumental task, we need to unpack, three main themes from the sources?
Yeah, three big ones. First, the real nature of those 40 years. The educational aspect.
Right, the training period.
Second, the genuinely revolutionary content of the covenant, the law they carried inside that ark.
Okay.
And third, the actual character of the holy war itself.
Right.
What did that really mean?
Let's start with the wilderness years then. That 40-year period. It looms so large in the story, but often it gets simplified, right?
Yeah.
Seen as punishment.
That's the dominant view. Historically, culturally, it's often seen as primarily punitive.
Yeah.
Celestial detention for disobedience.
That whole interpretation, the rebellious generation has to wait, they die off. It makes the 40 years just a consequence of failure.
And according to our source material, that completely misses the forest for the trees.
Okay.
The sources argue, quite strongly, that the 40 years weren't primarily punitive. I mean, sure, failure happened, consequences followed. But fundamentally, they were an absolutely necessary educational and training period.
Necessary. Why so necessary?
Well, think about the mission. Create the holiest culture possible. They needed time, and importantly, time in a controlled environment, away from Egypt, away from Canaan, away from those existing, let's say, corrupting influences.
Ah, like a cultural incubator.
Sort of, yeah. To acquire and, crucially, practice the specific cultural, social, economic tools they'd need for this new society.
So it was basically nation-building boot camp?
That's a good way to put it.
But why couldn't they just go straight into Canaan? If it was promised, why the long detour? Why this 40-year training?
Because they lack the structure. You have to remember where they just came from.
Egypt. Slavery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Slaves in Egypt. A society that was highly centralized, bureaucratic, authoritarian, defined by Pharaoh's absolute power, these massive public works. They were used to taking orders, having life dictated from the top down.
Okay.
They were completely unprepared culturally and structurally to manage the kind of society the covenant demanded, which was decentralized, community-driven, based on mutual responsibility.
And the land itself, Canaan, you mentioned it was tough. That added to the challenge. It wasn't like the Nile Delta.
Not at all. Canaan's environment was harsh. No single, reliable, massive river system like the Nile. Farming depended heavily on seasonal rains, the former and latter rains, which could be, unpredictable.
Right.
You had to develop complex systems, cisterns, wells, often in rocky terrain, just to survive, let alone flourish. Took incredible levels of collective responsibility, water management, mutual economic support.
So the wilderness wasn't just about wandering, it was the lab, where they learned to depend on their system, their covenant, not on a pharaoh or an easy river.
That's the argument. It forced reliance on the internal structure they were building.
Which makes the training incredibly practical then. It goes way beyond just, abstract spirituality or prayer.
Absolutely. They needed functioning systems for community operation.
And this is where the source material gets really interesting with the ritual structures, the tabernacle, sacrifices, altars, offerings. The claim is they were more than just religious rites.
Far more. The interpretation is that these were the civic operating systems. They were being implemented, tested, refined during those 40 years. Blueprints for a complex society.
Okay, let's break that down. The analogy to modern governance is really striking here. Politically, first, the sources talk about localized sanctuaries later on, after settlement. How is that like decentralized governance?
Well, the interpretation is that instead of one massive central temple controlling everything, political life, spiritual life, kind of like the structures they left in Egypt.
Oh, right. Top down again.
Exactly. The gradual development of these regional religious centers, it actually fostered decentralized power. It encouraged local autonomy. Regional communities could manage their own affairs, both faith and daily life.
Which makes the society more resilient, less likely a decollapse if the center fails.
That's the idea. Greater resilience, adaptability. The law was universal, the covenant applied everywhere, but its day-to-day application was localized.
Okay, that's the political structure. But the economic system view is maybe even more fascinating. How do the sources connect the sacrificial and offering system to, like, an ancient social safety net?
Yeah, the comparison is drawn very directly. The accumulated goods from festivals, from various offerings, they're likened to modern ideas like life assurance, disaster insurance, just general social safety nets.
Wow.
This is where you see the real depth of the training. It wasn't just about belief. It was about building a functioning, supportive economy.
But wouldn't that be unstable? I mean, offerings, even required ones, surely they'd fluctuate. How could that be as reliable as, say, a mandatory tax system? Wouldn't people be vulnerable if the harvest failed or something?
That's a really crucial question. And the answer, according to the sources, lies in how structured and mandatory these obligations actually were. It wasn't just about voluntary goodwill, like putting a few coins in a collection plate. The law mandated multiple layers of obligation. Different tithes, different offerings, specifically aimed at redistribution, not just, supporting the priesthood or the tabernacle upkeep.
Can you give some specific examples? How did this mechanism work on the ground?
Okay, well, think about the third-year tithe, for instance. While some offerings definitely supported the operational costs of the communal rituals, certain tithes were explicitly earmarked for the marginalized.
Like who?
The text specifies the resident alien, the widow, the orphan, those without traditional family or land-based support systems. And then you have things like the gleaning laws.
Right, leaving the corners of the fields unharvested.
Exactly. Farmers were required by law to leave grain behind, so the poor could gather food for themselves without having to beg. It was a system designed to provide sustenance while preserving dignity.
So the community treasury or storehouse wasn't just a general fund. It was a highly regulated social welfare system designed to stop people falling through the cracks permanently.
That's precisely the interpretation. The communal stores, funded by these structured offerings, were specifically used to help community members hit by sudden shocks.
Like illness, crop failure, a natural disaster.
In Eduhos.
Yeah.
The system was there to allow that person, that family, to recover economically, to avoid falling into that spiral of irreversible debt, or worse, having to sell themselves or their children into servitude.
Which was common in other cultures at the time.
Absolutely common.
Yeah.
This system was designed to prevent that, to maintain the integrity and freedom of every member of the community. So those 40 years, they were about embedding this practical, ethical, mutually supportive social contract deep into their culture, proving they could build something strong enough to survive anywhere.
Okay, so they've done the training, they're carrying this blueprint, this holy culture, and now they're finally ready to enter Canaan. Which brings us to section 2, the revolutionary covenant. And the way they entered was, well, deliberately provocative, wasn't it?
Completely. When they advanced, the front line wasn't soldiers with spears. It was priests blowing trumpets, Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Now, in the ancient Near East, that formation, it looked like they were getting ready for war, but the strategy itself was completely inverted.
Because normally you'd bring your god's statue, right? The physical image, the idol. That's what was supposed to guarantee victory, fight alongside you.
Exactly. The enemies, the Canaanite city-states, they would have expected to see some kind of physical representation of Israel's God leading the charge, a war god, carved in stone or cast in metal, looking formidable.
But the ark, the source of their power, it had no image like that inside, and this is where it gets really critical. What was inside?
The stone tablets, inscribed with the Ten Commandments.
The core of the contract, the law.
Right. And you have to imagine what a radical visual performance this was for the ancient world.
The message is just stunning. Our God can't be captured in stone or metal. Our God isn't defined by a physical form, but by an invisible promise and this absolute law.
It's a declaration that their entire civilization, their power, their identity, is governed by ethics, by a contract, not by a physical manifestation of might.
It was a visual performance saying their relationship with the divine wasn't about bowing to an image, but about adhering to a governing contract, a blueprint for how to live, how to build society.
And the source material argues that the sound of those trumpets, echoing across the land, it wasn't just a battle cry, it was a broadcast. It was announcing, we are entering this land under a completely new paradigm. We're defined by this revolutionary law.
Okay, to really get how revolutionary that law was, we need to put it in context. The dominant legal framework back then was the suzerain vassal treaty, right?
Absolutely critical to understand the inversion. Yes,
Yeah.
suzerainty treaties were the standard for international relations, basically.
Right.
Think of them as the ancient rulebook for how a superpower, the suzerain, dealt with a weaker, subjugated state, the vassal.
And these treaties were fundamentally unequal, exploitative.
Inherently. Designed to extract loyalty, service, tribute, soldiers, all flowing one way, from the vassal up to the suzerain.
Can you quickly walk us through the typical structure? Because knowing that structure really highlights how the Israelite covenant flipped it on its head.
Sure. A typical treaty, say, from the Hittites or Assyrians, followed a pretty standard pattern. First, the preamble, identifying the powerful suzerain, listing his titles.
Okay.
Second, the historical prologue, recounting all the supposedly gracious things the suzerain did for the vassal, usually rescuing them or putting them on the throne, but always framing it as justification for demanding obedience later.
So the kindness is just the setup for the demands.
Pretty much. Third, the stipulations.
Yeah.
The list of duties: pay tribute, provide troops, don't ally with enemies, report conspiracies. Absolute loyalty was key.
Where else?
Then you'd have clauses about depositing the treaty document in temples, reading it publicly at regular intervals. And finally, maybe most importantly, the massive lists of curses and blessings.
The enforcement mechanism.
Exactly. The curses for disobedience were always detailed and terrifying. Drought, famine, disease, military defeat, annihilation, enforced by the gods of the suzerain. The blessings for loyalty, usually pretty minimal. The vassal's role was purely passive: obey, pay up, or face destruction.
Okay. And the Israelite covenant, the tablets in the Ark, it had some similar structural elements, preamble, history, stipulations. But the content, the actual relationship defined, completely inverted that power dynamic.
That's the core argument. An inversion that was just unimaginable at the time. Everyone, all the surrounding nations, would have expected Israel's God, Yahweh, to act as the ultimate suzerain, demanding total submission from Israel, the weak vassal he had supposedly rescued from Egypt.
But that's not what the covenant actually sets up.
According to this analysis, no. It places God in a role that's dynamically much closer to, well, a servant or a partner, a helper, an assistant who is committed to working for humanities, specifically for Israel in this context.
Whoa, okay. God as a servant or partner, that sounds incredibly subversive. How did the sources handle that? Doesn't that diminish God's sovereignty?
That's where you have to link it back to the overall mission. God's sovereignty isn't denied or diminished, it's fundamentally redefined.
How so?
Instead of sovereignty being shown through demanding tribute and exploiting the vassal like earthly kings did, God's power, God's sovereignty, is demonstrated by empowering the vassal, Israel, to achieve the actual goal: justice and peace. Shalom.
So God assists them in creating this holy culture, which is the primary sovereign goal. The relationship becomes about empowerment, not domination.
Precisely. God isn't extracting value. God is investing power and assistance into the project.
Okay, so if God takes on this role of ultimate partner, ultimate helper, what does that do to Israel's position? They're not the passive, subservient vassal anymore.
No, they're elevated. They become the agent, the principal, the master in the relationship, responsible for enacting God's will, which is justice, peace, shalom in the world.
So Israel isn't just a tool. They're the responsible party. The ones who have to make the decisions, implement the law.
Exactly. The source stresses this point. They are the active, responsible decision makers who must live out the covenant. This whole contractual relationship was a direct rejection of every single top-down hierarchical assumption, social, political, theological, of the ancient world. God doesn't just demand submission. God offers partnership and the necessary assistance for humans to create a just society if they hold up their end of the bargain, if they adhere to the law.
So those trumpets, they weren't just announcing a new presence, they were broadcasting a social and theological revolution. Our God doesn't conquer us, he assists us so we can serve justice in the world.
It transforms the entire entry into Canaan from simple military conquest into launching a cultural mandate.
A mandate which leads directly to the next big topic, the definition of the conflict itself, the Holy War.
Yes, and understanding that covenant inversion is key to understanding what the sources say this holy war actually was. It wasn't just war against Canaanites. It was a declaration of war against the entire existing world order, the one defined by exploitation and hierarchy.
Okay, let's define this holy war. The term itself is obviously loaded. It carries centuries of baggage, often implying divinely sanctioned violence and conquest. We need to be clear what the sources say it was not.
Right. It was not about grabbing land for its own sake, not about resource extraction, not about enslaving populations. Those were the standard goals of ancient warfare, the things that fueled those constant escalating cycles of violence, build taller walls, forge stronger weapons.
The usual pattern.
Exactly. According to the source analysis, this holy war wasn't just a typical conquest where God happens to be on their side, helping them win battles. It was defined fundamentally as a war to end the very necessity of war itself.
Wow, okay, that's a paradox. A war to abolish war.
Precisely. The ultimate overarching goal wasn't just victory over Canaan. It was to break that endless, self-destructive cycle of human greed, hatred, violence, and establish true shalom on earth.
And shalom here. It's crucial we understand it means more than just peace, as in no fighting, right?
Much more. The source really emphasizes this. Shalom is better understood as wholeness, completeness, comprehensive well-being.
So it includes the political stability, the economic justice, the social harmony they were practicing or learning to practice in the wilderness.
Yes, it's not merely the absence of conflict. It's the active presence of justice, equity, security, wholeness. A society that achieves shalom has eliminated internal strife, guaranteed economic stability for everyone, established political justice through that decentralized model, the whole package.
So the Holy War was this paradoxical strategic conflict aimed at dismantling the entire culture of conflict, both within and without.
That's the argument, a final war to abolish the culture of war.
This connects to that universal longing for peace, doesn't it? And the source material ties this into an interesting concept, self-evidence.
Yes, the concept of self-evidence, Jamie Owen's song in the original Korean lectures, I believe. The idea is that the true good news, the true gospel, must have this quality.
Meaning, it can't just appeal to insiders.
Right. It has to resonate universally. It must appeal fundamentally to all humanity.
What specifically defines this self-evidence? How does it work?
It means the core message must be so fundamentally valuable, so obviously good, that anyone, regardless of their background, their religion, their nationality, their ideology, hears it and instinctively nods. They recognize, yes, that outcome would be truly good. It's a message that people have, as the source puts it, no legitimate grounds to refuse.
Okay, I think so. If you try to sell someone on a specific new god or a complex theological system, they can easily refuse based on their existing beliefs or lack thereof.
Exactly. There are grounds for refusal.
But if the message is, let's end endless human suffering, poverty, violence, and war, well, who's going to argue against that in principle? It's universally desirable.
Correct. The promise of ending that ceaseless cycle of destruction that possesses this self-evidence. It aligns with a fundamental, universal human desire for security, stability, wholeness for shalom. And that was the underlying principle, the weapon of the Holy War. It was meant to demonstrate a self-evidently better path, proven not through more violence, but through demonstrating a superior, just, peace-oriented culture.
And the very first, most dramatic demonstration of this, the self-evident, peace-focused revolution, was aimed squarely at Jericho.
Yes, and the choice of Jericho was absolutely packed with symbolism.
Why Jericho specifically?
Well, geographically, it was central, strategically vital for entering the land. Historically, it was incredibly ancient, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. It represented established civilization, entrenched power structures.
But the main thing?
The main thing, militarily, was that Jericho was known everywhere as the strongest, most difficult-to-breach fortress in the region. Its walls were legendary. It was the ultimate symbol of military might, of entrenched absolute defense, the impregnable citadel.
Which sets up the paradox in its sharpest form, doesn't it? You take these cultural trainees, fresh from 40 years of learning social systems, not siege warfare.
Right, not career soldiers.
And you command them to attack the strongest possible military target, and crucially, to do it without using military force.
Imagine being a soldier on those massive walls, trained your whole life for siege warfare, rams, ladders, archers, assaults. You look down and see this
Priests, trumpets, and a box.
a bizarre procession circling the city. No siege engines, no massed infantry ranks ready to charge, just priests blowing horns and carrying this ark, this box containing the law. What is the psychological impact of that, even before anything happens to the walls? The confrontation was deliberately designed to be utterly unconventional, to confound military expectations.
Because, as the source argues, this was the core logic of the war to end war in action. If your goal is to abolish the very culture of war, you cannot achieve it using the standard tools of war.
Exactly. You can't bring the culture of violence, military strategy, weapons, conquest mentality with you if your aim is to destroy violence itself. It's a contradiction.
So the goal was to demonstrate that the strongest physical military structure, Jericho's walls, could be overcome not by superior force, but by something completely different.
By the holy culture and the peaceful law that the people had been practicing and embodying for 40 years, it was a direct confrontation. Culture versus might, law versus walls.
But we have to address the elephant in the room here. The biblical story ends with destruction. The walls fall, the city is destroyed, the population killed. How does this interpretation, focusing on nonviolence and cultural confrontation, reconcile with that violent outcome described in the text?
That tension is absolutely central. And the source's interpretation focuses very heavily on the symbolism of the walls themselves.
Yeah.
If the mission is the abolition of the culture of war, then the walls, which are the ultimate physical symbol of defensiveness, isolation, fear, military power, keeping others out, hoarding resources, those must be utterly abolished. The destruction of the city in this reading isn't presented as a standard military conquest for spoils or territory. It's interpreted more as a ritual dismantling, a symbolic destruction of the very idea of relying on military might and defensive isolation.
So the non-military act, the circling, the trumpets, the shouting, was designed to signal the end of the age defined by military power and the beginning of a new era governed by the law, by the covenant of peace. The failure of the walls was the proof, the evidence that the self-evident message of shalom was superior.
That's the interpretation. The seemingly invincible structure collapses when confronted by this different kind of power. And the final statement about Jericho really drives this point home. The incredibly severe curse placed upon anyone who would ever try to rebuild the city.
Right. If the goal was just military strategy, securing a key location, you'd absolutely rebuild that fortress later. It makes perfect strategic sense.
Of course.
But the curse forbids it completely, which suggests the focus was never on the strategic value of the place, but on the symbolic value of its destruction.
Exactly. The curse is read as this final, powerful declaration. The era defined by walls representing war, fear, defensiveness, the isolationist culture of military solutions. That era is over, permanently. The community was being forbidden in the strongest possible terms from ever seeking to return to that old way of thinking, that reliance on defensive, violent structures, even if it seemed tactically smart down the road.
The message was, your security lies in the covenant, in the law, in the just culture you build, not in stone walls.
Trust the system, not the fortress.
Which brings us pretty much to the end of this deep dive. We've traced this foundational story through 3 really quite radical reinterpretations from our sources.
Yeah, we've definitely shifted the perspective, Canaan. Not a gift, but a difficult long-term project. The 40 years. Not just punishment, but essential cultural training for building social resilience and justice.
Yeah.
And the Holy War. Not standard conquest, but the strategic, paradoxical pursuit of comprehensive shalom, aimed at abolishing the very need for war.
And the central theme that seems to cut across all of this, the thread connecting them, is this profound question about power, isn't it? When we face big problems today, huge modern challenges like economic inequality, social division, international conflict, what kind of power should we be trying to use?
That's the core question the sources seem to pose. Should we rely on the same kind of power that defines the current system? The sword of the world, you might say, power based on centralized authority, maybe exploitation, military dominance, building walls.
Or is there another way? Should we try to utilize that different kind of power? The transformative, maybe nonviolent power of the holy culture, the power of the just contract, the kind that focuses on mutual support, on demonstrating a self-evident message of justice and peace that aims to eliminate the need for swords altogether.
The sources strongly suggest that true lasting change doesn't come from conquering the world using its own violent methods. It comes from presenting a culturally superior, ethically compelling, self-evident message of peace and justice, one that ultimately disarms opposition through its own inherent merit.
The kind of power shown at Jericho in this reading wasn't the power that crushes the enemy physically. It was the power of a prepared, committed culture embodying a different set of values, causing the old, unjust structures, the walls to collapse under the weight of their own inadequacy and contradiction.
A cultural power that makes the old ways obsolete.
Okay, so a final thought for you, the listener, as you mull over all this. We spent a lot of time today on the context, the why, the preparation, the covenant, the goal of shalom, maybe a little less on the specifics of the famous event itself.
Right. The source lecture didn't delve deeply into the mechanics of the 7 circuits, the final shout, and so on.
So here's our challenge to you. Go back and revisit that story of Jericho. Read the account again, but try reading it entirely through the lens we've discussed today.
See the whole event not as a straightforward military miracle designed to inspire awe or terror, but as this deliberately disarmed peace march confronting the ultimate symbol of human violence and division.
And ask yourself, given the detailed economic and social system they were supposedly trained in, given the radical inversion of the power dynamic in the covenant they carried, what does the success of that nonviolent, culturally driven approach actually tell you about where true, sustainable power might really come from in our world?
It's definitely a fascinating foundation for your own next inquiry.